Greetings. How's everyone doing? All right. Good. Sorry. Okay. I'm going to be talking about the whole subject of reparations. Is there anyone in the room who has never heard of reparations? Okay, so everybody's familiar with reparations. Is there anyone in the room who would consider themselves a reparations activist? Okay, all right. Well, welcome. I'm going to cover several aspects in this presentation. So I'm just going to let you know what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be going through explaining the meaning of reparations. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of reparations activism and advocacy in the UK. I'm going to be sharing with you how people in the UK have articulated the struggle for reparations. And I'm going to suggest some ways of how we go about achieving reparations. And finally, I'm going to end with some suggestions as to what you can do to support the reparations movement. Okay, just in terms of a little bit of an introduction to myself, I'm a reparationist, which basically means I'm a reparations activist. That's how I prefer to describe myself, and in terms of my activism, the reparations movement is where I cut my teeth and just got straight thrown into the reparations movement, not only in the UK, but actually internationally. In a very short space of time. I'm also a jurisconsult, which is a specialist in applied jurisprudence, the science, the philosophy, and the study of the law through its actual practice, as opposed to what we see on statute books. I'm a broadcaster on Voice of Africa Radio. I'm also a PhD researcher, researching the history of the African reparations movement in the UK. And I'm also a board member of Anti-Slavery International and co-vice chair of the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, and also, I should add, co-chair of the Interim National Organising Committee of the National African People's Parliament. Now, I mention all of those kind of organisations and coalitions and so forth because those are the various arenas in which I do my reparations activism. And so what I'm going to be sharing with you today is going to be some snippets from these various arenas to give you an insight into what's been happening in the UK around this issue. Just begin with some notes on the terminology that I'm using. Now, the term reparations, describing compensation, which is how I think most people commonly understand it, only came about in around 1921. And it wasn't used in that sense before that time. Now, the term was used by the French at the Paris Conference to describe proposed sanctions against Germany for nations it victimised during the so-called First World War. So prior to this time, which is 1921, terms such as indemnity and war payments were employed to describe what some saw as punitive sanctions against aggressor states following a defeat in war. Now, I mention that because it's important to recognise that although the term reparations wasn't used in the way in which we use it today, prior to 1921, doesn't mean that there was no reparations movement, or no reparations advocacy, or no reparations activism. And that's really important to understand, because one of the areas that we need to be looking at is what is the history of this movement. Reparations is becoming popular again. Certainly we've had a visit recently from Professor Hilary Beckles, who is the author of the book Britain's Black Debt. Has anyone seen that book? Got it? Okay. The manual at the back. This is a copy of it here. And it's really the case coming from the Caribbean. Well, a particular narrative coming from the Caribbean, I should say. It's not quite complete. But in it, he also links into some of the things that have been taking place in Britain. There's a chapter on Britain. And so some of us who have actually been involved in reparations work are included in this chapter. But despite the fact that books like this, and last week I know there was the talk on the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project, which again, even though it's focused on where the money went in terms of so-called enslavers, reparations is, yes, becoming topical again. However, it's important to recognise that this is an issue, it's a movement that has a long history, especially in Britain. And one of the things that I'm seeking to do through the research that I'm engaging in is to correct the narrative and to actually write us into the historical record in Britain. Because a lot of the research, up until some of the scholarship now coming out of the Caribbean, was very much focused on the United States of America and the movement there, and to a lesser degree on the continent of Africa. But there hasn't really been a publication that has come out of Britain that talks about the contribution that we in Britain have made to this global movement. And I'm going to be correcting that through looking at the historical record on what we have done. Now I'm going to come back to describing reparations shortly, but there's some other terms that I want to just get out the way, because I don't make an assumption that we all understand things in the same way, and it's important for me to give these foundational terms because I'll probably be referring to them consistently throughout my presentation. Now, oftentimes when we think of reparations, you often hear that reparations is about what? Reparations for slavery. And probably to a lesser extent, colonialism. Yes? Does everyone agree with that? All right? Okay. Well, there is a notion called colonial enslavement. So we talk about chattel slavery, or more correctly, enslavement. And there's also a notion of colonial enslavement. Okay? So when we're talking about enslavement, and certainly when I talk about it, I am not just referring to what happened prior to so-called abolition in terms of 1807, which was the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, or 1833, which was the Abolition of Slavery Act. I'm talking about the continuum of the experience of enslavement that African people have gone through.
Yeah.
Okay? And so what we look at is chattel enslavement, we look at colonial enslavement, and there's also a recognition of modern day enslavement, which is neo-colonial enslavement. Now, colonial enslavement is a pernicious quality of it is that the subject peoples have no choice. They are born into a state of slavery and have very little, if any, means of appeal against it. So apartheid, for instance, in South Africa, and other forms of colonialism are considered to be colonial forms of slavery or enslavement, in that the enslavement affects a whole group of people who are still domiciled in the motherland, which is Africa. So we must understand that enslavement was not just something that those of us whose ancestors were kidnapped from the shores of Africa into the Americas and the Caribbean, and how many of us ended up here by virtue of being British subjects. We're not just talking about our experience alone. Now, sometimes that's controversial. I have been challenged on that from some of our people who basically feel that the experience of chattel enslavement was the worst experience ever, and that it shouldn't be equated to colonialism. Well, that's not the view of the reparations movement, and so I'm just saying that to you very early, okay? But sure, when we open up for questions or comments, then I'd like to hear what you have to say. So this notion of enslavement being a continuum is very much part of the traditions of those who we rely on in terms of our theoretical understanding of what enslavement is. So I've already mentioned the first three phases in the chattelization area, which is chattel enslavement, colonialism, and then there's neo-colonialism, which Dr. Kwame Nkrumah referred to as the worst form of imperialism. And then there's a concept now that a scholar from the motherland in this book called The Fourth Phase of Enslavement refers to as being the plight of African immigrants in the West, and in particular looking at the realities of life in Europe and other industrialized countries as an African immigrant. So I think it's important when we're talking about reparations for us to have an understanding of each other's experience and for us to have a dialogue as to how we believe we have been affected by this history, but also how this history is continuing to shape us today. And I say that because in 2007, which was the bicentenary of the British Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, rather than our communities coming together, there was quite a lot of division between some who would define themselves as Caribbean and, some who are from the continent. And there was quite a lot of division that was being stoked up between us on the basis that, well, it was the Africans who sold us out. And so part of the reparations conversation has to also look honestly at this notion of being sold out and who got sold out by whom, and also what is our role, especially those of us of African Caribbean heritage. What was our role? Were we just victims? And if we understand enslavement as being a continuum, we also have to assess our role today. And are many of us selling out today? So nobody actually escapes this rigorous critique. So the term reparations has its origin in Latin, the verb reparare. And it basically means, in modern English, to repair, to restore to good condition after damage, to wear, to set right, or to make amends for a loss, a wrong, or an error. Okay? The Oxford Dictionary describes reparation as being the act of restoring something to a proper or a former state. The action of repairing or mending something, and the action of making amends for a wrong or loss and compensation. Now, typically, if you are not very familiar with the reparations movement, then the way in which you probably know anything about reparations is through what you've heard in the mass media. And unfortunately, the mass media likes scandal, and they like what they consider to be something that's going to catch on and sell newspapers. And so what they like is all the talk about money and how much we say we're owed and how much we want to claim from white people. So the focus is very much on compensation. However, remember what the term actually means. So if we are saying compensation and we mean compensation, then that's the word that we should use. If we mean reparation, then we should understand the holistic and full meaning of what reparations is. Now, the definition that we use in most of us, that is, in terms of reparations activists in the UK, and there's been some battle around this, but I think it's more or less been accepted now. We use a definition from Professor Chinwezu, a Nigerian public intellectual. And basically, Professor Chinwezu, at a conference in Nigeria in 1992-1993, which was called the Abuja Conference, which was the first conference on reparations for chattel enslavement, colonialism and neo-colonialism, came up with a concept paper. And this is now the definition that is gaining credence globally. So the definition goes something like this. Reparation is not just about money. In fact, money is not even 1% of what reparation is about. Reparation is mostly about making repairs, self-made repairs on ourselves, mental repairs, psychological repairs, cultural repairs, organizational repairs, social repairs, economic repairs, political repairs, educational repairs, repairs of every type that we need in order to recreate and sustain viable black societies. More important than any monies to be received. Now, he doesn't say money's not part of it, but he says more important than that. More fundamental than any lands to be recovered is the opportunity the reparations campaign offers us for the rehabilitation of black people, by black people, for black people. Opportunities for the rehabilitation of our minds, our material condition, our collective reputations, our cultures, our memories, our self-respect, our religions, our political traditions, and our family institutions. But first and foremost, for the rehabilitation of our minds. So that is a fuller understanding of reparations being about repairs of every kind that we need in order to rebuild ourselves as individuals, but as communities and as peoples, and ultimately as a nation of people. So reparations as repair is really the way in which reparationists have articulated the struggle for reparations. Now, there are many others who are entitled to their viewpoint. You know, there are many scholars who are gaining PhDs and gaining professorships by writing about the reparations movement from outside of it. But those of us within have the right to define and control the terms and to be able to speak to the world as to how we see the movement. And so this is the knowledge that is coming from within the movement, and I am coming today and sharing some of that knowledge with you. Okay?
Yeah.
So, reparations as repair means that reparations should be viewed as an obligation to make the repairs necessary to correct current harms that have been caused as a result of past wrongs. Under this view, reparations becomes a process that restores hope and dignity and standing and rebuilds us as people, but also as communities. Reparations for Africans and people of African descent, conceived as repair, can help mend the larger tears in our social fabric. The tears that I've already mentioned in terms of some of the divisions amongst us, some of the trauma and some of the pain that we're still carrying. This is all part of what we are seeking to repair within the movement. Now, reparations basically then is a sacred right and a demand for justice. It's a principle of international law. It's a movement to develop and liberate African peoples. And it is a necessary step to acquire the resources necessary to heal, to repair, and to restore us as a people. Ultimately, though, reparations is a process that only we can and must do for ourselves. Reparations is not a paycheck. So, you know, I've had a few phone calls this week after all this database information where people have been like, oh, where's the reparations movement at? Are we any closer to getting the money? And I know because of austerity and people are losing benefits and losing jobs, then, you know, I understand. But actually, that's not what it's about. Okay? That's not really what it's about. And reparations is not begging anyone to do anything for us. Okay? So actually there are two dimensions to reparations, and I'm going through this in quite a lot of detail because if we don't get the foundation right, then we're not going to understand the whole conversation. So there are two aspects of reparations. There's what we call the internal, and then there's the external. Now oftentimes, once again, the media that does unfortunately shape lots of our consciousness and understanding of ourselves and each other likes to focus on the external. Okay, European governments owe, the British governments owe, corporations owe, certain families owe. Yes, okay, that's part of it. But as I said, reparations is both internal and external. Now, the internal is what we must do for ourselves. Okay? And the internal, which is what we call self-repair or self-reparations, must precede external reparations, which is what we're saying others have to do. The debt that is owed us in terms of our stolen inheritance and so forth. So it's not to say that that's not important, but it's where we put the emphasis. And actually the emphasis should be on our self-repair. Because it's only when we repair ourselves and heal some of the divisions amongst us, heal some of the wounds that we have, some of the hatred, the self-hatred that we have, that we are then going to be in a position to force those external to our community to enforce our will in terms of what we say they owe us. A weak people has never ever achieved any form of repair. Never. So the external is what we say they owe us, and they is broad. But the internal is what we owe ourselves. Okay? It's what we owe each other. And the most important aspect of reparations is the internal, or the self-reparations. Because, as I've already said, that will generate the power that we need to demand external reparations from everybody that owes us. Okay? So if we just focus on what they owe us and what they've done, then we are not going to be building the power. We're just going to be lone voices in the wind for, centuries saying, well, we're owed this and we're owed that. But nothing's going to change. So again, what I'm saying is what's come from the movement, but this is also validated in terms of international human rights law. But I did say reparations is also a principle of international law. So there's something called the Basic Principles and Guidelines on the Right to a Remedy and Reparations for Victims of Gross Violations of International Human Rights Law and Serious Violations of International Humanitarian Law. Came out in 2005, but it was based on something called the Van Boven Principles, an international lawyer basically. And according to this United Nations framework, well, you can't get any more mainstream than that, all right? there are 5 aspects to reparations. So bear in mind how we have defined it from within the movement, but equally now this is what at the international level, in terms of the government of nations and peoples, how they understand it, and there's actually a lot of synergy between the two. The first one being restitution, and I'm going to explain what these terms mean, but I'll just go through them. Second one being compensation, which is what we all kind of probably know a bit about. Third one being rehabilitation. The fourth one, satisfaction. And the fifth one, guarantees of non-repetition. So, restitution. Now, there's a book called The Guilt of Nations by somebody called Elazar Balkan. That is a picture of him. It's quite a well-known book for, because this is a serious area of study. It's not just whimsical. Reparations law and practice and policy is an emerging study that's huge, because all kinds of peoples and groups and so forth have achieved or are seeking some kind of reparation. So anyway, in this book, Balkan basically says that restitution is the entire spectrum of attempts to rectify a historical injustice. So that's everything that we need to do to undo or wipe out the effects of what we have gone through. Now, I used some terms earlier, enslavement and colonialism, and we can say neo-colonialism. Okay, those words, 3 simple words, but they cover a huge multitude of sins and harms and crimes and violations of our human rights. Again, under restitution then, let me give you an idea of some of the things that this might look like and how we have conceptualized it within the movement. It would include things like restoring our liberty, our human rights basically, our family life, restoring a citizenship. So many of us who are happy to have the British citizenship, but where did we come from? Many of us have acquired the British citizenship by virtue of our parents or grandparents coming from the Caribbean as colonial subjects. So what is our true nationality? It's not about your passport. What is your nationality in terms of your ethnicity and your people, your identity, okay? So restoring our identity and citizenship. In some places it's a return to one's place of residence, which we often call repatriation. And many in the Rastafari community have been championing repatriation for decades, okay? It also means restoring lost employment and status and property. So who were we? Who are we today? Are we today who we were historically? It would include redrawing the colonial borders of Africa, because Africa today is still carved up on the basis of the map that was developed at the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, according to their law, okay? And so today we are fighting fratricidal wars on the basis of borders and imposed nationalities on the continent of Africa. It would include actually restoring some of the indigenous states that we had in Africa, or evolving it to a United States of Africa.
Say it loud.
Restoring some of the indigenous states and kingdoms that we had, or evolving it into a United States of Africa. That would be restitution. It would include repossession of lands, communal repossession of lands, not the private property system that we have on the basis of willing buyer, willing seller. So peoples in many countries in Africa whose land was stolen by invaders being forced to buy back land which is theirs. That's absurd. Okay? It would involve an African rememory process, which is a process of reclaiming our historical memory as African people. Because that's part of the damage. Oh, I'm Black British. Oh, I'm Black American. I'm French, I'm this, I'm that. We're all everything else apart from African. But that's who we were. Okay? Now, this rememory process is necessary to heal some of the psychic injuries caused by centuries of cultural and spiritual murder. So many of us are alive today, but we're like zombies because we are not rooted anywhere. You know, I was born here and never ever felt this was my home, despite people telling me, but you're British. And then I remember when my parents took me home to the Caribbean, to the countries where they were from, and they would call me English. And I'm like, I'm not English. How can I be English? Barbados and Guyana, they would be saying, especially in Barbados, they would say, oh, she's English. All the crazy people come from England. And then when I got to go back to the motherland, to Ghana, which is where my mother's ancestors were taken from, they were calling me Obroni, foreigner, okay? So I actually believe and feel like I'm what I call myself an original refugee, in that I'm stateless, okay? And many of our people are the same. Just because you have the passport doesn't mean that you belong, okay? It would include, we're still on restitution now, it would include the elimination of africidal traits, yes, including internalized Afrophobia, which is anti-African prejudice and discrimination. And we carry that. You know, these are part of the trauma. We dark skin and light skin and good hair and bad hair and, oh no, you know. These are some of the things that we still carry as legacies, if we're honest. It would also include eradicating internalized Europhilia, love of everything European, and Arabophilia as well, which affects some of our people on the continent who will tell you they're Arabs, although really they're African, okay? It would include restoring and renewing our languages and our cultures. This is restitution, because what did we do? What was taken away? It would include organised, voluntary repatriation, not involuntary. Now, when the late Bernie Grant MP was alive, he caused a storm by promoting this. And it was used against him, not just by the right-wing press, but many of our people attacked Bernie Grant. Many of our own people, they're there in the Bernie Grant archives, all the information is there. Many of the so-called black newspapers, many of the so-called black leadership were saying, why is he trying to throw us out of Britain? This is our home, we're British. But we're talking about voluntary. Many of our people are returning to the Caribbean, or they're returning to Africa, because they're tired of trying to fit in to a society that still treats us as second-class citizens, despite, I mean, we heard in the presentation before, everything that we have contributed to this society, and we're still being treated as strangers and second-class citizens. How long are we going to have our humanity denied? It would include, we're still on restitution, reunification of our families. So unifying those of us who have all these different ethnicities and labels and names in terms of the countries, in the Caribbean, in the Americas and Africa. Reunifying us. Because even in the Caribbean, if we trace our African ancestry, we come from distinct African peoples. So when did we become British? Okay. It would include Pan-African citizenship. Not citizenship of Nigeria or Ghana or wherever. One citizenship. A Pan-African citizenship or an African citizenship. Just like with the British passport, you can go all over Europe. Why should we have, all these national borders dividing us? It would include building independent institutions of education, healthcare, employment, spirituality and culture. It would include a repeal of some of the unjust colonial laws that are still on the statute books in Africa and the Caribbean. And then they tell us we don't know how to promote human rights. Well, a lot of these laws are their laws. But unfortunately, at so-called independence, the heads of state didn't correct. It would include the return of all our stolen wealth, including our cultural, sacred and hallowed property. For instance, the Benin bronzes and all the other property, that some of which was included in the presentation that we saw before. That's restitution. That's just the first strand. Right? Now, reparations is all of it. It's not just taking one, you know. Oh, reparations for all of us is just Pan-African citizenship. No, it's all of it. So that's why we don't rush to the money thing. Because if we rush to the money thing, we're going to actually sell ourselves short as to what our true reparations will entail. So let's just get a sense of the whole of it. Compensation requires that wrongdoers pay damages to persons or groups harmed by their past conduct for any economically accessible damage that is proportional to the gravity of the violation. So compensatory reparations authorize the payment of damages for physical, political, psychological, economic, and other harms suffered. So how did we suffer politically? How did we suffer, and how are we continuing to suffer psychologically? Just go to the local mental health hospital and see who's filling it up. How are we suffering economically? We know the big picture stuff in terms of so-called indebtedness. I'll talk about that later. Not only in Africa, but the Caribbean, in terms of IMF World Bank loans. But how are we suffering economically within our communities here in Britain? And what about all the other harms? Now, that would then be a long-term commitment to financing, resourcing, and supporting all of the efforts that African people, people of African descent, and our allies make to repair the damage and to try to make good the losses suffered as a result of the Holocaust of African enslavement, chattel, colonial, and neo-colonial enslavement, and the impacts of their legacies today. So I don't know how much money that would be, but it'll be a whole heap in terms of repairing us globally, and even us as an extension of a global nation of people here in Britain. It would include something called restitution of the value of the unjust enrichment to Europe and every other nation that has benefited from the expropriation of African labour and resources. So we was hearing about gold earlier. Restitution, if all of that gold were to be counted up and we were to put a monetary figure on it, we would have to then chart from the time they started taking this without consent, without permission from Africa, right up to today. I don't even think they've made the money or how we would even classify it. Yeah? Now, it's not only, as I said, our labour, it's about the lands, the value of that, the minerals, the raw materials that are still coming out. So DRC, the war there, the conflicts there, we all love all these gadgets, iPhones and this, the iPad and all of that. Where's it all coming from? In terms of the minerals. So this is what it would entail. This is what we're owed, okay? So let's just not get caught up on the little paycheck.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
It would also include damages for physical or mental harm, including pain, suffering, or emotional distress. And it's not only about us as individuals, it's about the damage that we see in our families. We were harmed not as individuals, we were harmed as families and communities. So within our families, we will see this damage. Even if we think we're okay, there'll be people in our family who just haven't been able. We say, why can't they pull themselves up? Why can't they move on? So we need to look within our families and see where the repair needs to happen. It would include things like damages for lost opportunities, including proper education, employment, recreation and leisure. Who are we today? So many of our professionals come here, study, get the qualifications. Why? Because it's not valued. Their own qualifications, our own qualifications back home, are not valued.
True.
So we come here, and many of our expert people are having to take jobs below their level, driving taxis, doing all kinds of things, starting businesses, but we're not really earning the money that we should be earning according to the investment we have made in educating ourselves. Okay? It would include damages for not only the loss of earnings, but our loss of earning potential. And this is historically, we start with ourselves today, because that's what we know. And then even if we were to just do a little bit of family history, who were our family members? What would be the value of some of the professions that they have? Many of the healers within our communities, many of the mothers at home who do like 10 jobs. If we were to put an economic value on that, what would it be? Now that is the loss of earning potential. This is how, from a legal standpoint, you calculate damages. It would also include funds for scholarship and community development, damages for harm to our reputation and our dignity. So today, you go in the papers, and if you say something about somebody and they've got enough money, they'll sue you for libel and slander. But what about the damage done to our group?
Yes.
So that if you walk in a shop, it happens to me, it's not only our brothers, but I walk in a shop, the security guard's asking me if I want, are you all right? They're following you. And it's like, well, yes, I am. I'm just looking, thank you. And many of us experience this. Why? Because somebody has a perspective on who we are, on the basis of how we look. Not on the basis of hearing someone talk so they can think, oh, she's not from here. It's how we look. So that is part of the group damage to our reputation. In the earlier presentation, there was that whole thing about Ali G. And again, that's part of it. Because what damage is that doing to the collective reputation of our men? Okay? Now that we can put an economic value on that, if we valued ourselves, but we value everyone else, so when it comes to us, we just want to shortchange ourselves. So let's just start adding it up. Okay? I'm not saying, as I said, like Chinwezu said, it's not that money's not part of this, but let's get the full figures down. Alright? And we don't start negotiating with nobody until we've done a full account. And nobody has the right to start negotiating behind our backs on behalf of anybody until we've done that full account.
That's true.
So, in PARCO, which is the Reparations Coalition I come from, we say that receiving the financial component of reparations will be meaningful only that is, if it serves the holistic purpose and strengthens the integral whole of our own self-repair process. Although no sum of money could ever erase our pain or wash away the blood our glorious ancestors shed at the hands of their enslavers, we must have all that is necessary for restoring ourselves and future generations to the correct Pan-African heights of global justice for all. So that's what we say in terms of PARCO. Now moving on to rehabilitation. Rehabilitation includes medical and psychological care, as well as the provision of legal and social services. Now we know the legal system is an area where we're suffering plenty too. Yeah, the healthcare system, the mental health care system. So rehabilitation would include things like, or measures like, respecting and enhancing our own indigenous institutions of holistic healing. Yeah. Not just pushing all these drugs. You know, a lot of our people with diabetes and hypertension, they're just pushing these drugs on them that are so toxic. Okay? It's not just about sustaining the NHS as it is. It's looking at, we want true health. And we need to recover and restore our true health. It would include the provision of culturally competent medical, social care and rehabilitation facilities. So when we get sick, are the hospitals providing for our cultural needs? For a start, they tell you it's just 2 people by a bed. And many of us have big families. So it's not culturally competent. Okay? And that's in all aspects. It's even in the so-called systems of correction or prisons or jails. Are they culturally appropriate for us? Did we have jails? No. How did we deal with people who went against the group norms? You see, these are the things that we need to do by way of restoring and repairing ourselves. It would include, this is under rehabilitation, from a legal standpoint, free social security measures for all Africans and our descendants. And so that's very relevant to these cuts and austerity measures, because I'm not saying other people shouldn't have benefits cut and everything like that, but I'm talking today about the case of African reparations. So in light of all the wealth that we have generated, that shouldn't be applying to us. Shouldn't be applying to us. It would include healing from intergenerational Stockholm syndrome, where we fall in love with our oppressors. We emulate them. We want to be like them. We want to be close to them. When they're sick, we're sicker than them. It would include healing from post-traumatic slavery syndrome, colonial syndrome. Dr. Joy DeGuy is an expert on this. And there's also somebody called Maria Braveheart who's done a lot of work with indigenous communities in the Americas, and she talks about historical trauma, which is the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across generations. So that is the traumas that we pass down from family to family, that we haven't healed from. Now when scandals happen in this country, in some village somewhere, maybe a child has been taken, kidnapped, and horrific things been done, the whole town gets counselling, therapeutic support. But what have we had? What have we had? And yet we're expected to just cope and get on with it. Our women are expected to be strong, our brothers are expected to be strong, and we do our best. But I think what's going on with our children today tells us that something's wrong. Something is seriously wrong. So I don't care how successful you think you are. I don't care how good a job you have. What's happening? What's your children doing? What's going on with your children? And sometimes we might say, well, my child is okay, but your child is part of a village. What's happening to the other children in the village? Do we care? This is rehabilitation now. Fourth and fifth aspects of the reparations modalities according to the UN framework. Fourth one is satisfaction, which includes official apologies, criminal prosecutions, truth commissions, truth seeking. We want to know what happened. We want to know what happened to some of those who were assassinated and disappeared within our communities, etc. It includes things like monuments and museums and commemoration days and curricular change. And guarantees of non-repetition can range from reforms in the security sector, the police sector, or the judiciary, to broader institutional reforms that might include, for example, constitutional changes, such as what happened in Kenya a few years ago with their change of constitution. It would include judicial or administrative sanctions against people responsible for continued violations. So some of the people who were perpetrators of crimes during colonialism are still alive today. And a very key case that is just, sharpens our lens on this is what's happening around the Mau Mau case. Okay, the Kenya Land and Freedom Army. And some of the torturers of some of the Kenyan people are still living in nice little places, some near and some far in England today. So it's not like everyone's dead. They love to tell us, yeah, but it happened a long time ago and they're all dead. No, actually some of them are still alive.
Very much alive.
Where are they?
That's another presentation. Okay.
It's serious, we want to know where they are.
Yeah, definitely, but that is another presentation because there's so many that we need to call out. Seriously.
That was last week. That was last week's presentation.
Okay.
Who got the money?
That's part of it, but there's more to it too. And I think that does, in all seriousness, require a distinct presentation. Now, it would include things like setting up tribunals, not just going into their courts where they are the judges and the juries and the executioners. How do we expect to get justice when the very people who have benefited and legitimized our continued sufferation are in control of things today? So we need to have new courts, we need to have new justice models. It would include things like asserting our full sovereignty. Because, for instance, the Aboriginal peoples in Australia, they have this saying, sovereignty never ceded, which basically means the white invaders and colonialists who claimed that the land was uninhabited, just like they did in the Americas, the original people who were always there never gave up their sovereignty. They never gave up their freedom, they never gave up their independence, and neither did we on the continent. And we've never ever regained sovereignty, actually. That is why we still have colonial borders that the slave masters designed. That is why we still have to pay for land. That's because we are not sovereign. It would include us developing a global superpower. We've spoken about the United States of Africa that could actually link the peoples of Africa, the children of Africa, where we have been scattered across the four corners of the earth, including in the Caribbean. And this initiative is already underway, where many Caribbean countries are linking back up with the African Union and the peoples of Africa, okay, on the ground in something called the African Union 6th Region Diaspora Initiative. It would include building a new world order and a new economic order. These are some of the reparations guarantees of non-repetition, which means how do we ensure that what has happened to us never happens again? Yeah. But guess what? It's happening again. Chattel slavery still goes on today. Yeah, people are still being trafficked, and I'm talking about African people, through London. Okay, so it is happening again. So unfortunately, we are not like the Jews who can say never again, because it's happening to us again already. And some of us seem totally oblivious or choose to not see it. It would include restoring our self-determination and our nationhood. So it would mean going beyond ethnicity, going beyond being just African peoples or people of African descent, if that's too much of a leap for you. Because some of our people, you know, we don't want to be African. But it would include going beyond being peoples to becoming a nation. You know, like in the Americas, they call themselves First Nations. Yes. They're not just individuals, they're not peoples. They say, we are nations. You harmed us as a nation. Yes. It's nations that deal with nations. Yeah. That's how we end being subjects and have true citizenship, which is global. So we've gone through the Chin-Razor reparations framework. It's quite holistic. The reparations that we are seeking, that we are organising towards, internal repairs and external repairs, is about self-made repairs, mental, psychological, cultural, organisational, institutional, social, economic, political, educational, family, relationship, repairs in ourself and our group understanding, repairs to our sense of dignity, value and worth, and repairs to our reputation. All of that is reparation. All right? That's what we need to be dealing with. that agenda, and we need a framework that can deal with every aspect of those repairs. So I titled this talk, Is There a Social Movement in Britain? I've kind of gone a long way into explaining what reparations is so that we have a clear understanding, but the more important question is, what are we doing about it? Is there a social movement in Britain? What do people think?
Yes.
There is.
Okay, that's good to know. And why is it important to study social movements, do you think? Anyone got any ideas?
Learn from the mistakes.
Yeah. So it goes beyond also the individual, because one of the ways in which we often do history is we kind of elevate individuals. And it's fine if you're a great individual, but what about the rest of us? Who see ourselves as being ordinary people? Where do we fit in? You know, and sometimes it can be quite disempowering. So we focus on social movements because in focusing on the social movement, we can see where we fit in, and we recognise that it takes collectives. Even if there's a figurehead, we know that any change that we've achieved, it wasn't just that one person. They might have been the person who was allowed through the door. They might have been the person who white people would talk to. But it doesn't mean they one did it. And when we talk about social movement, then we factor ourselves into the reparations movement. We don't sit down and wait for leaders. We don't sit down and wait for black MPs. We don't sit down and wait for the next saviour that wants to pounce on us, okay, and go and get us our reparations. We realise that it's about what we have to do. And if you're not in it, then I'm sorry, you don't have those entitlements. Because remember, the damage was done to families. So that would be like somebody dying in your family, a parent who's got 5 children, and just one of them wants to run away with everyone's inheritance. How does that work? Doesn't work, does it?
No.
What about the rest? We're all entitled, so we all have to have a say and come to some understanding of what it is we're saying we need in order to fix ourselves. So social movements have been defined as conscious, organised and collective actions to bring about or to resist social change. Now, compared to other forms of collective action, such as riots and so forth, distinctive features include organisation, consciousness raising, non-institutionalised strategies. So we don't follow what everyone says we have to do. Oh, go and lobby your MP. Okay, fine. All right. Yeah, okay, later. And prolonged duration. That's what social movement's about. And all the gains that we have ever made as a people, however we define ourselves, have been through social movements. Whether we say anti-slavery movement, forget the Wilberforce stuff, we led anti-slavery movements. Anti-colonial movements, Pan-African movement, Black Power movement, women's movement, civil rights movement. All the gains that we have ever achieved has been because people came together and they challenged the status quo. And a lot of what we had to do, even in terms of sometimes being in institutions like this, where there was a colour bar in Britain, was we had to break laws. Yeah. We had to go against what was considered to be the existing law of the day. That's why, when was racism supposedly eradicated by law in this country? Does anyone know? So prior to that, it was okay for them to have those signs. And many of our parents or grandparents, they talk about this in terms of when they came to this country. It was common to see those signs. No blacks, no coloureds, no this, no that. Yeah, so what does that mean? It means before that, we were not considered equal human beings with white people in this society. And that's not that long ago. So a social movement then is a collective, organised, sustained and non-institutional challenge to authorities, to power holders, or to cultural beliefs and practices. So reparations, you've already answered the question, there is a social movement around reparations in this country. And it's important for people like me, who is in the university, to try and bring this understanding, what we know in this room, that a lot of them don't know, or they pretend not to know. And so that's what my work is going to be seeking to do, in terms of recovering the history that we have created around this question of reparations in Britain. Because social movements, in terms of our social movements of black people of African and African Caribbean heritage, are not very well studied in academia. Yeah, they put it down to, oh yes, some great leader, because they don't like to actually teach that we know how to organize and that we can develop strategy and that, you know, we know what we're doing. They just see it all as being, spontaneous eruptions. And that's part of a narrative that is a historical narrative, okay? And so I'm really locating this research within the context of a social movement. So it's not only about individuals, it's about what were the organizations, who were the grassroots leaders that have been championing the cause of reparations. Now, in terms of how we affect reparations, I don't use the term pay reparations, because if I want to talk about payment, I'll talk about compensation alone. But if I'm using the term, and I'm humbly suggesting to you, if you use the term reparations, please do not restrict it to compensation. It's causing enormous damage and confusion. Use the correct term. If you mean compensation, say it. If you mean reparations, then understand what reparations means holistically in your everyday discourse, okay? Now, there's the political organising, mass mobilisation and movement building front, which is a vital strand to how we affect or we achieve reparations. There's also international lobbying and networking, again, another vital front. So it's looking at how we link with those in the Caribbean, those in the Americas, those on the continent, those in Australasia, Oceania, peoples of African heritage. There's also litigation, and the stages of that are an apology for the wrong, an investigation of what's happened and an accounting of the damage, compensation for victims, and also prosecution of wrongdoers. Then there's parliamentary front or legislation, and there's organisational and institutional change. Now for me, from within the movement, I can say the first two and the last one are the most important: political organising, mass mobilisation and movement building, international lobbying and networking, and organisational and institutional change. Yeah? Because unless we're able to develop institutions that can hold this government and the European Union and everyone else to account, then we might as well forget it. And those measures are underway in our communities already, okay? So just going on, I'm not going to go too much, I'm going to skip this bit in terms of the research. I've kind of just given you an overview of what it's about. I'm really going to be studying the historical role of reparations thought, advocacy and activism in African and African diaspora social movement building experiences in the UK. And we've had loads of social movements in the UK, even those who are in the supplementary schools movement, that's a social movement. So there's loads of them, but there's not really a lot of mainstream academic recognition. And it's important, if our children are going into these institutions, that we have curricular change so that they can see themselves and their people's contributions in what they study. Not just in Black History Month either.
No, that's right, that's right.
It's their contributions to every discipline, to law, to economics, to accounting, to science, to technology, to nursing, to whatever it is we've done, that needs to be reflected. So again, when we're talking about reparations, a lot of us like to go to what it is that we think we're owed just by focusing on three words: slavery, colonialism, and neo-colonialism. But it's important that we recognise the full nature of the harms, and I'm just going to give a few snippets here, because from a legal and a political standpoint, when we are looking at accounting, which is how we measure the damage and the harms, we have to go beyond the word slavery or enslavement because it gets used a lot. But what does it mean? It's a big word that covers a multitude of sins. So during chattel slavery, I'm just going to share a few things with you in terms of the debt, the wrongs and the violations of our human rights and our rights as peoples. So, for instance, the destruction of relationships, of family systems, of our indigenous forms of organisation, the destruction of our economies, the destruction of our philosophies and worldviews, the violation of our family structures, such as the buying and selling of family members, which created a tear in our social fabric, not only in our families but our communities and our nations, passing on of traumatic genetic memory transgenerationally, wild-scale and systemic sexual exploitation and abuse of men, women and children, mass death and genocide. All this is under chattel slavery, yeah? So when we use the term enslavement, let's just add it all up. Yeah, we're adding it all up. We're talking about acts of torture and brutality. It was the process by which we became on people, which is so-called in the US Constitution, 3/5 of a human being. It was the denial and loss of our identity and history, the institutionalization of white supremacy and black inferiority. It also was the carving up of Africa, the continuation of wars of destabilization. There was massive extermination programs, massive incarceration of peoples, the establishment of colonial regimes, military invasions and annexations, imposition of private property regimes, imposition of unequal treaties, okay, that signed away our rights, the loss of land rights for women, vital. Colonial administrations, imposition of direct or indirect rule, imposition of physical and administrative borders which divided us and were controlled by the European metropolis, cultural genocide in terms of a civilizing mission, curtailment of our civil and human rights, armed robbery and plunder of lands, etc., etc., etc. You get an idea. So that's just under chattel slavery. I'm not even going to bother to go into what happened under colonialism and neo-colonialism, but these are all actionable violations of human and people's rights. So before we even come to accounting in terms of what will reparations look like, we have to fully define what the outstanding debt is. Yeah? We have to fully articulate that in our narratives, in our conversations, in our policies, and in our legal frameworks. So now coming on to what's been happening around Britain. All right? Now, this chap here, does anyone know who it is? Wilberforce. Wilberforce. Okay, now this was a speech that he made in 1789. He said, "Let us make a reparation to Africa, so far as we can, by establishing a trade upon true commercial principles, and we shall soon find the rectitude of our conduct rewarded by the benefits of a regular and a growing commerce." What trade is he talking about? Right. So that's, you see the word reparation is in there, but he's not using it in the way in which we use it, right? Doesn't mean the same thing. This is the British elite's view of reparations, okay? 1792, William Pitt the Younger. Yeah, Prime Minister. He said, "No nation has plunged so deeply into this guilt as Great Britain." What's he talking about? Right, 1792. Then we have the British elite's view of 1926. This is Sir Austin Chamberlain. And he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, yes, and a statesman. And he said, "Certain crimes are regarded as being, in a peculiar degree, crimes against the human race. His Majesty's government consider that there is a general consensus of opinion in civilized states that the slave trade constitutes a crime of this nature." So you can see there's a recognition that, okay, we've done something wrong here, yeah? And it's huge, it's big, you know. But then we come to the British elite's view, and this person here, we should all know him, right? Former Prime Minister, Tony Blair. And what does he say in 2006? It's hard to believe what would now be a crime against humanity was legal at the time. Oh, really? So how comes, like, in 1792, Prime Minister knew that it was wrong, 1926, Chancellor of the Exchequer, this speaking on behalf of the British government, said so-called slave trade was a crime against the human race, which was the term that they used then for a crime against humanity. And crimes against humanity, genocide and war crimes are the most serious crimes in international law. You don't get more serious than that. Yes. So in 2006, how comes we have Prime Minister Blair, and many of us got our OBs and MBs around this time and all of that, but how comes he's saying, in our living memory now, that it was legal at the time? Right? And how comes this isn't being challenged? Because many of us, I hear conversations with people say, oh yeah, but it was legal. What was legal?
Yeah.
Was the Jewish Holocaust legal? No, it was not.
In Germany it was.
By whose? By whose standards? Did the Jews see it as being legal?
No.
Yeah, so what are you saying then?
Did the Jews see it legal?
It was not legal. It was not legal. Simple.
Alright, I've opened a can of worms here.
And we have one speaker, please.
And it just goes to show, though, we need to be careful with this terminology of being legal. Because legal for whom? Just because people pass a piece of legislation to justify the unjustifiable does not make it legal. Because law has to conform to morality. And there is a concept of international morality. So let us not buy into this thing. We might use the term legalized, which means they sought to make it legal. That was a political process. But that's not the same thing as saying it was legal. So the movement in Britain, we trace back to 1791. Otobo Kugwano, who basically was the first African to raise the question that we've identified thus far, and certainly in terms of the research I'm doing, but it will probably go back beyond him. He was the first African writer in the English language to raise the question of restitution for the injuries of enslavement in 1791. Okay? And there's a whole heap that comes in between that. All right? Now, the next person that we identify is Robert Wedderburn, who was born in Jamaica to an African-born enslaved woman and a plantation owner. And he was an ultra-radical leader and anti-slavery advocate in early 19th century London. Wedderburn went on to become a leading activist against slavery and was imprisoned for attacking the government's position on the transatlantic traffic in enslaved Africans. Now, Wedderburn saw strong links between the situation of African enslaved in the Caribbean and also the disenfranchised white poor of Europe. And in this regard, he advocated for land reform. And he advocated for land reform in Britain. So a return of land to the commons. Because a lot of this whole thing about, private property and all of that also dispossessed many of the European people here in Britain. So he is also somebody who has articulated a reparations struggle in terms of being about land. But he didn't just link it to Africa or the Caribbean. He spoke about those who were descendants of the enslaved who were in the Europe also had a right to land. And that there needed to be substantial land reform, yes? Then we have John Archer. I'm moving swiftly on now to give you some of the history. John Archer, does anyone know who he was?
First black man.
Okay. In 1918, he was called a race man because he had race politics, race consciousness politics. In his presidential address to the inaugural meeting in Newcastle of the African Progress Union, he observed in his speech that a lot was being said in the aftermath of the so-called World War I. about indemnities on the one hand, reparation on the other. He reminded Europeans about the great wrong inflicted upon our forebears, asserting that the children of the white race today owe a great debt still to the children of the darker race, and went on to demand, not ask, but demand rights for Africa, including the right to self-determination, towards the goal of which he put forward his suggestion that by way of instalment they put down a motion for the better treatment of the term they used then was coloured races onto their rule, greater facilities for their educational advancement in part payment of the debt they owe them. That's a reparation statement right there. And many of us have learned about this man, but I'm sure nobody's told you that was reparations. And as historians, I've got a law background, but now I'm doing history. We are linking this as being the historical antecedents to the contemporary reparations movement. And who's this person? Marcus Mosiah Garvey, co-founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. In 1928, he gave a famous speech at the Century Theatre in London on the 2nd of September, in which, mindful of reparations, he said, among other things, that I am out for human justice, and I am sensible enough to know that so long as the robber retains the loot, the man who has lost his property cannot be at peace with his vicious neighbour or with anyone else. And it's a very long speech, which I really haven't got time to read fully. But another thing he said in it is, we 400 million black people desire, late though it may be, to restore ourselves to the company of nations. Remember the definition of reparations?
Yeah.
This is reparations right here.
Right here. That's right.
This is history that has been made right here. And even though I'm using figureheads, remember what I said about them being part of collective movements.
Yeah.
Okay?
That's right.
Then 1945, the Pan-African Congress in Manchester. Again, many of us will be familiar with this. We would have learnt about it. But that conference was a reparations conference because it was about how do we reclaim nations in terms of independence struggles and anti-colonial struggles in Africa and the Caribbean. Okay? So these people who were very much part of the founding of it, Amy Ashwood Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, George Padmore, Hastings Banda, and also Jeremiah Owoloyo of Nigeria. This is a reparations landmark. When we look at the history of reparations activism in Britain, gosh, we've got such a rich history. And one of the things that's key in Britain, I think that's a little bit different elsewhere, is that the movement in Britain from its inception has been Pan-African. Yeah? Because unlike Africans in America, even though I know that we've been here a long, long time, and you know, if you read Ancient and Modern Britons, it will say we was even here first, okay? However, the masses of our people, we know, came here 20th century, the masses that you currently see today. Unlike, say, the United States of America, where the masses have had longer in terms of development in America. So it meant that we naturally, because of our numbers in Britain, we had to link with other people from other Caribbean nations and also other African nations. And this wasn't happening in the Caribbean. I know my father, who was born in Barbados, always says he never met a Jamaican until he came to England. They didn't know anything about Jamaica. You're thinking, hang on a minute, these are all islands in the Caribbean.
Yeah,
but a lot of our people didn't mix. We didn't, you know, organize with each other. Now we come to the 1980s. So we're skipping a bit, and through the research, it's not complete. I've only just started in October. It's 3 years full time. There's a lot of gaps that I need to fill, so I'm just giving you some highlights here. But this is Ras Seymour. Do people know Ras Seymour? Okay, he was the London chaplain of the Ethiopian World Federation Incorporated, Jamaican-born. Ras Seymour McLean was jailed in the 1980s for 9 months for the theft of over 2,000 Ethiopian manuscripts from the British libraries, which he intended to return to Ethiopia. So remember, return of our property? He took some direct action, okay? Beyond the talk.
No one knows how you did it.
Yeah? And his story was actually turned into a Channel 4 film called The Book Liberator, so you should try and watch it. Then we come on to the African Reparations Movement. Do you know about the African Reparations Movement? This was founded by late Bernie Grant MP and others around 1992-1993. I earlier mentioned Professor Chinwezu and his definition of reparations. Well, Bernie Grant was a delegate at that conference in Nigeria. And at that conference that was organised by Chief Abiola of Nigeria, who sponsored it, they set up something called the Group of 12 Eminent Persons. It was organised under the auspices of the then Organisation of African Unity. Bernie Grant was one of that 12-member group. It was quite an elite group in terms of elites within our communities, but he was charged with the responsibility to come back to UK and galvanise a movement here in the UK. Now, it didn't mean he started anything, because I've gone into the historical trajectory, plus there were many grassroots groups organising around the time. So, for instance, there were groups like the Pan-African Congress movement, groups like the Huru movement, well, there's our Kebulan Revivalist movement, there was groups like All African People's Revolutionary Party, the Nation of Islam, and many, many other groups, grassroots groups, and there's many others I probably haven't mentioned, who I will also be interviewing in terms of getting their oral history of contributions they've made to this movement. Now, Bernie Grant, being an MP in British Parliament, obviously that kind of galvanised the movement in a different way, in terms of the movement was able to have access to resources that we didn't have before, you know, state resources, British state resources. And in fact, not only British state resources, a lot of the funding for the work that Bernie was doing came from the government of Nigeria, in terms of Chief Abiola at that time. Funded him to set up an office here in the UK. And the movement does need resources. So there was lots of battles as well, because in the Bernie Grant archives, which I would encourage everybody to go and look at, you see all the original documentation, you see the minutes, you see references to the grassroots groups who were even challenging Bernie in terms of, well, you know, who have you? You've just come on this thing, kind of thing, and we've been here. It's quite fascinating to study, because what it shows is that even within the reparations movement, we had different ideologies, we had different politics, and there was even a struggle amongst us, and that struggle still remains. And it's important for us to understand that historically, because then we can also understand why it is we'll have 10 people in a room that might all say they're reparations activists or supporters, and they're not all working together. Yeah? And we need to learn from this history so that we can correct some of the weaknesses that we have.
Yeah.
So the 1993 was when they opened the first working conference on the African reparations movement in the UK, and there were other members, I think Sam Walker, Black Cultural Archives, this is Dorothy Kuya here on the far left in Liverpool, Linda Bellos, many people will know, former leader of Lambeth Council. These were all members, and many others, of the African reparations movement. There was also people like Brother Kofi Mawali Clue, Brother Colin, who sends out loads of emails and stuff in our community. Yes, he was Colin Price, that's it. He was a member of the legal committee, and I never knew this until I went into the archives. as a reparations activist, I did not know this, and that's the point. We have to study our movement because these records are there, indisputable. Now, the African reparations movement had these objectives: to use all lawful means to obtain reparations for the enslavement and colonization of African people in Africa and the diaspora, to use all lawful means to secure the return of African artifacts from whichever places they are held, to seek an apology from Western governments for the enslavement and colonization of African people, to campaign for an acknowledgement of the contribution of African people to world history and civilization, and to campaign for an accurate portrayal of African history, and thus restore dignity and self-respect to African people, and finally to educate and inform African youth on the continent and in the diaspora, Caribbean, Britain, wherever we are, about the great African cultures, languages and civilizations. That's how the African reparations movement, as they call themselves, defined what their reparations goals were. So you can see already, going back to some of the definitions I gave you earlier, in particular Professor Chinwezu, we've been doing that work here.
Yes.
And if we understand reparations fully, we can see that reparations is already in process, right?
Yes.
In terms of our self-repair.
That's right.
So let's just be very clear about that.
Yes.
We're not sitting back waiting for someone to give us this check. We're getting on with the work.
That's right.
And this work is part of what we need to do in order to build the power to get everything we need externally. Yeah? And they concentrate very much on trying to repatriate the Benin bronzes as not just pieces of artwork, but part of the cultural patrimony of the peoples in Nigeria. Unfortunately, the campaign didn't quite succeed for a number of reasons, but it's still an ongoing campaign. And there are people who have continued on some of this campaigning. I think Brother Toyin, I've seen some correspondence on his website where he was writing, taking up this campaign. So there are different people who continue where some of us left off. And that's the thing to understand about the movement. Bernie Grant also put an early day motion in the Houses of Parliament in 1993 calling for reparations, and it called for debt repudiation and also a recognition of racism being a legacy of enslavement and the need for reparations for that, okay?
Yes.
And in terms of Bernie's advocacy and activism, he saw, and the others who worked with him, reparations as being about all of us. It wasn't just about Africans in the Caribbean or Caribbean people or so-called Black British people or people on the continent. It was all of us. It might look differently in terms of a Caribbean perspective, okay, but it was a one struggle, and I think that's really important to emphasize
Including the Irish.
of our people, because otherwise we will just allow ourselves to be divided and ruled again. I've already mentioned the first conference on reparations, and at that conference you had somebody called Lord Gifford. Does anyone know Lord Gifford? He is a British lord, and he will say he's Jamaican, a white Jamaican, and he was at the conference. It caused a bit of a stir because, as you can imagine, this is the African Reparations Conference, and Bernie took Lord Gifford with him. But Lord Gifford, being a barrister and lord and whatever, part of that kind of elite within British society, he was one of those white people who basically said, I'm going to support this cause of African reparations. And he developed something called a legal opinion on reparations for slavery and colonialism and neo-colonialism, which still is the authoritative legal opinion coming from a lord, which, you know, it might not mean a lot to some of us in this room, but in terms of British society, it means a lot. In terms of the bar and the judiciary, it means a lot when you have someone within saying, actually, this is a legal opinion. I give this my expert opinion, which kind of went beyond them saying slavery was legal and, you know, we can't be held to account. And there was 7 grounds to Lord Gifford's legal basis. One, that there is no statute of limitation and that there is precedent for African reparations, and international law basically provides us with the means to seek reparations. He says that enslavement was a crime against humanity, so this terminology again came from around that time. Second one, that international law recognises that those who commit crimes against humanity must make reparation. 3, there is no legal barrier to prevent those who suffer the consequences of crimes against humanity, which is those of us living today, from claiming reparations, even though crimes may have been committed against our ancestors. The claim would be brought on behalf of all Africans in Africa and the diaspora who suffer the consequences of the crimes of slavery and colonialism and all the rest, through the agency of an appropriate representative body. The claim would be brought against the governments of those countries which prompted and were enriched by the African slave trade and the institution of slavery. The amount of the claim would be assessed by experts in each aspect of life and in each region affected by enslavement. And finally, the claim, if not settled by agreement, would ultimately be determined by a special international tribunal recognised by all parties. That's not the World Court, it's not the International Criminal Court. We don't have that tribunal. Just like with the Jewish case, they had to establish the Nuremberg Tribunal. They had to set up a special court, and that's where the movement is at globally. But also it's important to recognise there are groups within our community, such as the Uhuru People's Movement, African Socialist International, that have established reparations tribunals for, I think, going back to the 1980s. So we do have expertise where we have been setting up our own tribunals, and this is not uncommon when it comes to these situations. Lord Gifford then initiated a debate in the Houses of Parliament in 1996. In 1998, there was a group called the Black Quest for Justice campaign that wrote to the government and basically demanded reparations. And then in 1999, there was a proposal to Liverpool City Council, initiated by Liverpool councillor Myrna Juarez from Belize, and this was the apology. So this was the first apology that came in terms of forced slavery, and this was in 1999. Now, what I don't know is who basically lobbied this councillor from within the African community in Liverpool to get this apology. Yeah, because when we look at history, we can't just look at the people who were in Parliament. We have to look at who went to them and took this cause to them and got them to use their position. Okay? So we're doing a history from below. There was also something called the National Assembly Against Racism that basically called for an apology of substance that would include compensation, it would include correcting our history, it would include recognising the damage of racism, cancelling debts, ending neo-colonialism and integrating black history within the British educational curriculum. This was a reparations demand of the National Assembly Against Racism mainstream anti-racist network, but it was African anti-racist activists that took this issue of reparations into the National Assembly Against Racism. Then we have a coalition, a grassroots coalition that's called the African United Action Front that was around, actually, I've got the dates wrong here, but from about 1992 I've seen the documentation till about 2001, and they were a body which African community grassroots organisations came together, and they organised a lot of marches and protests and so forth. So again, all of that is going to be coming in to the research. Now, I've just got another 5 minutes or so, and then I'll wrap up to bring us to today. In 2001, there was something called the World Conference Against Racism, where it was something called the Durban Programme of Action, and it was declared that slavery was a crime against humanity, but it should always have been so. So they did some technical legal drafting, which many of us, thought they were saying, well, slavery was a crime against humanity. But what they actually said is, well, it's a crime today, and it should always have been so in the past. So it wasn't as great again. But anyway, that was still quite significant in terms of 168 governments around the world signed up to that. Britain was dragged screaming and kicking. Now, after that conference, we as African people of African descent, came together at a conference called the African and African Descendants World Conference Against Racism. I was a co-organizer of that conference, one of the International Steering Committee of 10. And at the Barbados conference, we came up with a strategy, a global strategy and framework to unite ourselves as various reparations movements in Britain, in the Americas, in Africa. And one of the things that we did, we came here in the UK and we initiated a strategic legal action. Now, these are some of the groups, coalitions, formulations. At the Barbados conference, there was a formulation called the Global African Congress. And at the time, we also had something called the Black United Front Parliament that was initiated by the Nation of Islam. Now, the Black United Front Parliament no longer exists, but we now have a national, international African People's Parliament that has taken up the legacy of organising around this issue that was there before. So I'm showing you the historical continuity, and we have the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe. Now, it was, I'll come to the legal action. It was under the auspices of the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe that many of the groups that I mentioned came together and initiated a strategic legal action in 2003, really challenging the British law. Now, this is a unique contribution that we have made in Britain that is not there in the same way in other reparations movement, where we have challenged existing law and exposed it as being inadequate, whereas a lot of the other movements still see law as being a bit sacrosanct. And what we did is we said, okay, slavery was a crime against humanity to us, whether you recognise it or not. At that time, we sought to trigger the prosecutorial powers of the Attorney General to Her Majesty's government to prosecute Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II for crimes against humanity as head of British state. And we did this, grassroots groups, okay? This was 2003, and this was a class action on behalf of Africans and people of African descent worldwide. What we said is, okay, we are going to use, because in the way how the law was, I mean, it was so crazy, you have to go to the government to ask them to put their head of state on trial. Was that going to happen? Thank you. So, whereas in other jurisdictions, people were paying money into court and being scared of losing, we was like, we're not going to go through your normal legal channels. We're going to subvert your legal channels, and we require you to trigger your powers of investigation. And we got the response here that basically said, you can't sue Queen Elizabeth II because she's immune from prosecution. So that was good, because even though we knew that was the outcome we were going to get, a lot of our people didn't. And so it was a very good educational process to be able to demonstrate how law works in practice. And that still stands. Now, this was at the same time Saddam Hussein was on the throne. He was meant to be a sovereign leader, and we saw what happened to him. And, I was a legal advisor to this legal strategy, and we had Brother Kofi Mawuli-Klue and our chair, Malika Bediako, because it was done under a group called the Black Quest for Justice Campaign. This was just how The Voice reported it, awful. Where's the money, ma'am? And Monik caught up in reparations row, justice group set to sue Queen and Prime Minister for crimes against humanity. So this was legal history that we made in Britain that only the black press reported, okay? And I haven't got time to go into that. Then in 2004, the nearest we got in terms of a government minister accepting the issue of reparations was Fiona McTaggart, MP. She was then Home Office Minister. And we initiated a program, some grassroots groups again, under the auspices of a cross-community initiative called Rendezvous Victory that was African-led, developed this program. And it was in commemoration of 2004, which was the United Nations International Year for the struggle against slavery, which was commemorating the bicentenary of the Haitian Revolution. And we said on the programme, commemorations 2004 to 2007, because we knew 2007 was coming. But what we were trying to do was to get away from all this Wilberwash stuff and put reparations on the agenda, and we did this in 2003. And it says, time to resolve the big question of reparations. Fiona McTaggart came and launched this programme. We have a video of her supporting reparations, and then soon after there was a cabinet reshuffle, and then they put Prescott in charge of that bicentenary, and then it all became about Wilberforce. So even when there were white people who came to understand how we saw reparations, they just got moved out of the way. Yeah? Then there was somebody called Louise Ellman. She initiated a slavery memorial day in early day motion in 2004, which is how slavery now is a compulsory history topic. This was something that was requested of her from communities, black communities in Liverpool. So once again, when you see, she's a Jewish MP actually, but she was lobbied by her constituents in Liverpool to do this. Then we have Robert Beckford. He did a documentary in 2005 where a figure was put out there of 7.5 trillion. That was only talking about labour, lost labour. It didn't go into the whole debt. Yeah, and we have the British Legacies of Slave Ownership project, which some of you already know about, which shows where the 20 million compensation went. And then we had in 2007, the bicentenary year, we had protests, demonstrations outside when they were doing the service. And then we know Brother Toyin, his protest around reparations, asking for an apology. So this is part of the reparations history. Then the Militant for Genocide. And I close by looking at the international dimensions of our movement. Queen Mother Audley Moore, now deceased, stalwart in the reparations movement. She in America is called the godmother of the reparations movement. And she came to England in the 80s. We have the Queen Mother Moore School in Clapham that is run by Reverend Huey Andrews. So even though in the UK we've done our own little bit, we have linked into the global movement. Now, the person who carried on the baton, took over the mantle as being the godmother from the reparations movement, was Queen Mother Dorothy Benton Lewis, who is one of my personal mentors in the reparations movement. Unfortunately, she is now deceased. And I'm there, pictures of me in the US. The other picture is with the godfather of the reparations movement in the States, Imari Obadeli from the Republic of New Africa. Basically, a liberation group that were arguing for 5 states in the United States of America by way of reparations. Okay, and many of them were imprisoned, incarcerated, tortured, just like they did with the Black Panthers. So again, linking into the global movement. In 2004, some of us went to Zimbabwe when they were trying to engage in a regime change because of the land reform program. This is where the movement stretched to in terms of engaging in some of those struggles, and there was a lot of grassroots-led opposition to that, and the regime change didn't quite happen in the way they planned it. And this is just a cartoon where the Black United Front that actually led the delegation, we were in the newspaper and we were counted amongst some of the great liberation movements. So this is personally one of my favourite pieces of memorabilia from my activism, because I led that delegation to Zimbabwe. This was us in Ghana in 2006. There was the Reparations Conference in 1993. We then, under the auspices of NCOBRA, which is the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, organised a second conference on the continent of Africa on this issue, although it was the 3rd conference actually that took place. So you can see activists from the UK And there's Brother Glenroy Watson in the picture, who is a trade unionist here from the Global African Congress and RMT Union. Sister G. Bernard, also from Global African Congress, ex-councillor for Croydon. You can see how activists in the UK have been shaping and engaging with the international African reparations movement. This is me in actually 2006, Libya. And I was speaking to Colonel Gaddafi. And the conversation I was having with him was on his support for reparations. David Commichon, who is one of the foremost Pan-Africanists in the Caribbean, in Barbados, who has just brought out a book called It's the Healing of the Nation, The Case for Reparations in an Era of Recession and Recolonization, who talks about reparations in terms of Caribbean, Pan-Caribbean unity. Again, David and also Buddy Laria, who are stalwarts in the movement in the Caribbean, regularly pass through the UK, and we all link together and join our strategies and tactics. So I'm just showing you the global spread of this movement. And I guess I'm going to end here in terms of, I mentioned the Mau Mau case. Some of us are involved with this case, are supporting the Mau Mau veterans in this historic case against the British government for the crimes of colonialism. But it's not really about the court case, it's about the wider mobilisation that happens outside. And this is actually the pensioner that tortured one of the veterans here, Kenyan Wambugu Nyingi, and this is the ex-colonial officer Terence Gavagon, and he is still alive today, and this was reported in the Daily Mail. So this is where the movement has been. I've given you a snapshot of the journey that we have taken, and I think I've given you an inkling as to where we're going. Thank you.